When a loved one humiliates you, does it feel like they actually enjoy your pain? Have you ever wondered if the cruelty is part of a twisted game? Or do you think some part of them feels gratified by devaluing you? Do they actually enjoy your suffering? And if you've tuned into this episode because you've been accused or someone called you a narcissist, and now you catch yourself lashing out, withdrawing, or dismissing someone you love, maybe only to regret it later? Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today we're diving into a painful but important question. Why does the narcissist humiliate, devalue, and discard? It's not your imagination. These moments often feel calculated. The intent is rarely innocent. It's a way of exerting control, eroding your confidence, and distorting your sense of reality. To really see how this plays out, let's look at an everyday example of the ways humiliation shows up in relationships. Think about it. They belittle you, sometimes even in front of friends or family, turning small mistakes into, and I quote, proof that you're incompetent. They twist your words until you start questioning what you actually said. They insist your memory, your feelings, even your basic perception of events are wrong. It feels exhausting, disoriented, and can feel deeply humiliating. And yet, while it feels like pure malice, there's another side, something deeper driving this behavior. Behind every humiliation, every lie, every subtle twist of the story, there's a motive for this behavior. And that's what we'll explore next. I just said there's a motive for the manipulation, but let's be clear. Nothing we're about to explore excuses their behavior or your behavior. Humiliating you, lying, gaslighting, and manipulation are all destructive and harmful behaviors, and you're not imagining it. These actions are abusive and controlling. But when I said there's a motive for these behaviors, I should have been more precise. What I really mean is that there's an unconscious, and I quote, unconscious motive, something operating beneath awareness that shapes how you, or if you're the one who's quietly wondering about your own narcissistic traits, how you or someone relates to others. Whether you're the one feeling humiliated and dismissed, or you've been told you're the one doing the dismissing and humiliating. See, I'm straddling both sides of the fence here. And the question is, what if this behavior is not just about malice? What if I told you that the behavior isn't just about wanting to hurt somebody or being, and I quote, a sadistic narcissist, but about what you are unconsciously trying to protect within yourself? To truly understand what's happening and why you behave this way, we have to look underneath the surface, because the cruelty is often a defensive reaction, not just a manipulation. That said, I want to be clear. Sometimes it really is just a manipulation. In the case of what's known as malignant narcissism, the cruelty is typically a deliberate act designed to reconstitute their self-esteem by exerting power and control over others. This sadistic behavior may be about maintaining a sense of superiority and warding off the deep vulnerability they cannot tolerate within themselves. So yes, indeed, sometimes the behavior is intentional. That's known as a type of narcissism called malignant narcissism. But that's not the one we're discussing today. Okay, so what we are saying is this. Narcissistic behavior can have multiple layers. These behaviors can stem from unconscious defenses aimed at protecting fragile self-esteem. The defenses manifest directly. Some narcissists may withdraw emotionally, while others may engage in overly or overtly controlling or sadistic behaviors. Understanding these patterns is crucial, but it's also important to recognize that in some cases, especially with malignant narcissists, the cruelty is deliberate and aimed at exerting power and control over others. To see how this plays out in real life, let's look at a scenario that illustrates these dynamics in action. The best way to look underneath the surface is to examine a real-life scenario, something many of us can relate to. Let's take a simple, prototypical example. A man comes in reporting that his wife was upset and lashed out at him. She felt devalued and dismissed because he withdrew emotionally, wasn't fully listening, ignored her text messages for hours, and then, when she tried to express her feelings, when she tried to talk to him, he insisted she was overreacting. He argued that she wasn't being clear about the facts. The moment quickly spiraled into a circular debate where the focus shifted from actual communication to proving who was right. From the outside, people might call this stonewalling, gaslighting, or just plain selfishness. It looks like he's simply a bad communicator who refuses to listen. But when we explore the dynamics underneath, a deeper pattern emerges. This kind of interaction highlights exactly how narcissistic defenses operate in everyday relationships. But before we go deeper into why this happens, it's important to remember where these narcissistic dynamics primarily show up. Where is that? They typically show up in relationships. Narcissism isn't something that exists in isolation, although it feels like that sometimes. Predominantly, it plays out in the spaces between people, and that space is rarely neutral. It's often filled with fantasy, and I would say unconscious fantasy. So, we are just talking about where narcissistic relationships predominantly exist. And here's the crucial point. We have to remember that they don't exist in reality as much as they do in fantasy. This is what's known as, and I quote, the unconscious shared fantasy. I've spoken about this more extensively in prior episodes, but the core idea is this. The narcissist draws the other person into a world where roles are already assigned. You're not relating as two separate individuals. Instead, you're being pulled into a script the narcissist needs you to play out. And yes, you too need to play it out for your own reasons, but that's a story for another day. In this story, you may need an adoring partner, a devalued scapegoat, a doting caregiver, or a source of endless validation, just to name a few of these roles. If you experience this, you can imagine that in this fantasy, again, unconscious, it's not actively on somebody's mind. The narcissist needs, perceptions, and version of reality always takes priority. Anyone close to this type of person will notice and feel their own needs, perspectives, and reality are consistently pushed aside. So, when we look at the example of the man whose wife felt dismissed, it's not just that he wasn't listening in the moment. On one level, he was locked into a fantasy structure where her needs or something she did or said threatened him. And the only way he knew how to defend himself against this threat was to withdraw, not pay attention to her, get in his head, and even devalue her by ignoring her text messages for hours. This is how the unconscious fantasy starts to take over the living reality of the relationship. But let's go a little deeper into this idea of fantasy, because this is where things really come into focus. Narcissistic relationships frequently rest on fantasies of an idealized union, a vision of perfect togetherness and merging. At first, that fantasy may feel loving, uplifting, even magical to both partners. But when the fantasy is challenged, When one person asserts their own reality or independence, it can shift into domination, control, or hostility as a way to preserve the illusion. Let's pause here for a moment, because this part is really important. When you insist on your own version of reality, when you shut down your partner's perspective or make them question what they feel, what's really happening isn't just about control. Deep down, it's about keeping the fantasy of a perfect bond alive. It may look like you're trying to be right or to manage the situation, which are true, but something else is going on, right? Because underneath, it's an attempt to preserve the illusion of unity, a world where only your needs and your perceptions, your opinion matter. In that moment, you're holding on to the fantasy that difference and separateness don't exist, that nothing can challenge this perfect togetherness. See, in other words, if difference isn't there, then there's a sense of togetherness, and that's what keeps the illusion alive, if you can imagine that. So for this fellow, what he and I eventually discovered was that in his mind, every wish should be gratified. His wife should shield him, he came to say, from frustration, disappointment, or any unpleasant experience, such as going out with her friends, or even mentioning a prior relationship. These are all very frustrating experiences. Why? Because they foster a separation. This kind of stuff does not fit into the illusion of togetherness. Could you imagine going out with her friends? How is she there for him? Freud described this, and I quote, as primary narcissism. Now, that concept has a long history and has been modified over the years, but in short, it's about the infant's sense of omnipotence, the illusion of being, and I quote Freud, His Majesty the baby. You could picture that. The baby arrives and it's like all eyes on the baby. This is the template the narcissist unconsciously carries into adult relationships. And no, that does not mean that he's a baby, right? Because this gets updated over the years, but there's something about this sense of omnipotence and His Majesty. But what does this actually mean? What does this actually look like in everyday life and in relationships?
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. This idea of, and I quote, Your Majesty the baby, isn't just abstract theory. It shows up in real behaviors, interactions, and patterns with people who exhibit narcissistic characteristics. It shapes the way some individuals relate to others and how those around them experience the relationship. Now, let's press a little deeper into the inner workings of this mindset and see what drives these patterns beneath the surface. When we look closely at the dismissal, the withdrawal, the fighting and accusations, what we often uncover is this. When the other person is attentive and supportive, the narcissistic person feels he's entered the bliss of the idyllic state that I mentioned earlier. That's the perfect togetherness. He'll speak about having the best possible parents, the most perfect marriage, or an amazing weekend away. It feels like the fantasy in his mind has come true. But here's the catch. In this example I shared earlier, with the man becoming dismissive and blowing off his wife, I learned that this man was already feeling withdrawn and disconnected from his wife before she even began speaking to him. When I traced that feeling back, I found that the day before, she had been caught up in her work, or in another case, because this stuff is ubiquitous amongst these individuals. In another case, a wife needed space and retired to the bedroom earlier than usual. Or in yet even another case, a date arrived for date night slightly tired after the prior evening out with her friends. After containing the initial rage and blame directed at the other in all three of these examples, the initial act is always containment. Deeper exploration revealed a consistent underlying feeling in many of these cases. It wasn't fair to be left alone. That's the kind of stuff I would hear. It felt almost cruel, as if he had been abruptly and traumatically pushed out of that illusion of oneness. That's the Your Majesty the baby. That's what I'm trying to illustrate. In other words, she wasn't there to prop him up, to feed him. And if he cried, she didn't appear with food. So that fantasy of the perfect togetherness was ruptured. The collapse was sudden and unexpected, and it always is, because for someone with narcissistic traits, they get so deeply entrenched in this illusion of togetherness. For each of these people I just mentioned in these various different prototypical examples, for these individuals who exhibit narcissistic tendencies, the shattering of this fantasy is often experienced as a form of brutal abandonment. If the explosion out of paradise is too great, the experience can feel humiliating. There's simply too much shame to accept the loss of that perfect state. In these moments, you could feel betrayed, like the person you counted on suddenly left you and they let you down, and even turned into a persecutor who makes you feel, and I quote, bad or unworthy. And as you can imagine, these things have roots, right, in childhood, which I'll save for part 2. But in any matter, when this happens and you begin to feel this way, the mind fights back to quickly reestablish an equilibrium, because nobody likes to feel let down or betrayed or bad or unworthy or humiliated. So to reestablish an equilibrium, what do you imagine happens next? Let's keep going, because we're thinking about what happens when the party ends, when the blissful union with a loved one is broken, or when you are no longer treated as the priority. Remember, she retired to the bedroom early, made plans with friends, or was just deep in thought about her own work-related concerns. These are all major betrayals. Narcissistic defenses come into play, rooted in omnipotent fantasies that try to restore the bliss of the idealized union. Okay, so to return, that's the goal, to return to that place before the disillusionment occurred, if that makes sense. But if those defenses fail, right, if they don't work, if you still feel, even just for a moment, helpless, alone, and victimized, something more dangerous can take over. At that point, even more powerful and rigid defenses are mounted, ones that are harder to give up and far more destructive to both the self and the relationship. So in these moments, if I were inquiring, for example, with any of these prototypical cases, right? So for instance, if I said, when your wife retired to the bedroom, you seem quite troubled. Did you think about checking in with her? I might hear something like this from him. Who gives a shit about what's happening with her? Why would I check in with her? I'm not concerned about her problems. Why would I want to hear her complain when I have my own problems? So no, I didn't check in with her. In other words, if you're struggling with or exhibiting these narcissistic defenses, you are reacting to being wounded. But you, and most people would never know this, nobody knows this, because this is the moment where you may attack, withdraw, become passive aggressive, or silently hold a grudge. The inner logic might look something like this. Not again. I'm not going to be made to feel frightened, alone, powerless, or worthless ever again. So now I become strong and in control. See, that's the inner logic. But that's the stuff that I've been trying to get at that's not always conscious. Those deeper feelings are not visible, and the focus is typically on the egregious behaviors. In these moments, when the omnipotent fantasy cracks and the illusion of perfect togetherness is ruptured, the individual exhibiting narcissistic traits is not just resentful, they feel full of hatred. The aim can move beyond hurting you. It can feel like a need to annihilate you. That withdrawal, or the way you completely dismiss someone who was just experienced as a loved one yesterday, is not neutral. So withdrawal is not neutral. It's erasure. By not listening, by turning away, you're sending the message, you don't exist for me. Your words carry no weight. Your needs don't matter. See, in that silence, in that absence, is itself a form of annihilation. If you have someone like this in your life who's done this to you, you may know that one way to annihilate you is to erase you. Not physically, not that things get violent, although sometimes they do, with more of that malignant type of narcissism I mentioned earlier. But I'm talking about existentially. This is a feeling of erasure and annihilation, like you don't exist. And by the way, just as an aside, you could see the purpose of this, because if you don't exist, right, then there's no separate other. And they could get back to that illusion, right, that there's no loss, there's no separation. In order to protect themselves, they try to destroy your sense of self, your confidence, your reputation, your memory of what actually happened. Another common pattern I hear described goes like this. She hurt me, and I wanted her to feel that too. So I canceled our plans, I withdrew, and ignored her text messages all day when she was asking, what did I do wrong? In that moment, the goal wasn't simply to communicate hurt. It was to make her feel guilty, not only for having done something wrong, but as if something was fundamentally wrong with her. In my work with individuals like this, the goal is not to simply train them to be more attentive or present with their partner. That would miss the deeper issue. The real focus is on helping them recognize how much of their emotional world is dictated by the unconscious fantasy of togetherness and omnipotent control. Here's a critical point. In narcissistic dynamics, both external events and internal fantasies are always in play. A partner really does go to bed early, or really does need space. That's the external reality. But the fantasy world transforms the meaning of those events into catastrophic betrayal, abandonment, or humiliation. Both sides matter, the outer reality and the inner fantasy. But at different times, one can completely dominate the other. And when the fantasy takes over, it becomes stronger than what's actually happening in the room. In other words, the patient isn't really responding to their partner in reality. They're responding to the fantasy that has swallowed up the partner and recast them as the betrayer who abandons or disrespects me. I wanted to give you a clearer sense of the problem, not just what these narcissistic dynamics look like on the surface, but what it feels like to live inside of them. It's easy to focus only on the harm, the control, or the withdrawal, but the deeper question is why these patterns keep repeating. My point is that they are not simply choices or conscious strategies. They are defenses, shaped and sustained by illusion. the unconscious fantasy dynamics of what? Perfect togetherness. And that's exactly why understanding these dynamics is so important. The withdrawing, the devaluation, the subtle or overt humiliations, they're not random. They follow a script shaped by a fragile self trying desperately to protect itself. In the next episode, we'll explore what happens next. Once we can see these fantasies, understand their impact, and begin to challenge these patterns. So please, stay tuned for part 2 of this 2-part series on a few of the reasons or the motives behind your need to control, manipulate, lie, or withdraw from a difficult situation. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.